We talked about at the beginning of our season that this stay-at-home order jumped in out of nowhere, and you can't help but wonder what composers have stuff going on, or even if you're in the middle of a project, and then sure enough, we see the reports that, you know, your show Mrs. America was literally in the middle of scoring when you got the news. I'm curious, when did you find out about this, and what was going through your mind? I mean, there's no one to ask for advice on this situation.
Well, I mean, I think that once we started to feel like we might lock down in general, I was already starting to think about how we were going to do that. Just because, you know, my fiance and I had been following the news since it was in China, and I had a couple of shows in New York actually in May that I was supposed to do, and so those, one in May and one in March. And so even with those shows, I was looking at canceling those pretty early on. And so thinking about canceling those, I was also like, well, what are we going to do if that happens? And I think that I did have people to help me. I immediately called Peter Rotter, my contractor, and also Phil Eisler, and, you know, spoke to them about how they're approaching the situation. Peter Rotter had a list of 70 musicians, a lot of whom had already played on the Mrs. America score that had home setups. There were a couple of musicians that had played on scores for episodes 1 through 6 that didn't have home setups, so we helped them get set up at home and explained to them how they should record themselves and everything. And then, you know, by the time we were really into it and had to pull the trigger on it, we had already had everything in place, and so it really felt like it only slowed us down because the whole process takes a little bit longer, but we didn't have that lull of trying to figure out what we're going to do because we had already kind of put everything in motion.
Seems like you didn't even have time to panic. It was just like, let's figure this out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that the thing for me was that, you know, I still feel pretty new in this industry essentially, and this is still one of my first projects really when you look at it from you know, compared to somebody like Phil Eisler or Jeff Rousseau or these guys that have been doing it for a while. And I think that seeing not only all these other people that were still continuing to work, but also with our project specifically, they were trying to figure out how to do the ADR remotely, how to do the mix remotely, all these different things. And so I think I really felt myself like telling myself, let me not be the weakest link in this chain and make sure that I get everything taken care of. And yeah, like you said, there was no time to panic because, you know, they're looking to me for an answer of how we're going to solve it. And so I just wanted to make sure that I was able to contribute in that way since everybody else was figuring it out.
In some ways, what you just described is what your gig is in a way, which is problem solving, whether it's musically, when somebody says, I don't know, man, it's got to be funnier or sadder or faster. How do you solve that problem? But this is recording-istically, how do you make an orchestral sound remotely? The question I had just hearing you describe it is when you had musicians that said, we're not set up, the really lovely second part of that sentence was you didn't say, so we went and looked for people that had that. You said, so we showed them how to do it.
Yeah.
Did it mean that you had to tell people, go out and get this kind of gear? Or, I mean, what did you tell players that you wanted that weren't set up?
Yeah, exactly. Like telling them specifically what mics we would suggest them getting, you know, giving them options for different price points so they can figure out what's going to be best for them, and what interfaces they should use. And then my mixing engineer also spent time with them on FaceTime, setting it up, you know, doing trial recordings and everything, just wanting to make sure that, for me, it felt like some of these people had already been an integral part to the sound of the score. They've been on some of the first episodes, and in a lot of ways, some of these are friends. Like one person in particular that I'm thinking of is a friend of mine from high school that now is like one of the top call cellists in LA, and she didn't have a home recording setup. And for me, I felt like that would make me a little sad if she wasn't a part of, you know, these final episodes. And so really it was just wanting to make sure that we took care of the people that were already being so helpful with us with the score.
What was the biggest challenge, would you say? I know that during this time, a lot of places, like even when we were trying to set up our remote setup for this season of the podcast, we had to order equipment. And if it wasn't deemed essential, it would take like a month to get certain things. And I'm just curious, like at what point was FX or the studio in charge of the show, were they worried at all about the timing and just how long things were taking?
Not at all. I really appreciated them. I mean, it felt like they had complete trust in me to figure out how to get it done. And they were, if anything, more flexible with the time. I mean, I think we might have extended some of the mixes a little bit so that we had a little bit more leeway to try to finish the score, and also everything else, all the ADR and all of that kind of stuff, because I think some of the actors were even recording, on their iPhones from home or whatever for some of those things. And so that all took a little bit more time, but really they just kept asking me, what do I need? I think that was the thing that I really appreciated about being in that position, was that it wasn't I didn't feel the demand to get it done as much as I felt, how can we help you make sure that you get this done the way that you want to get it done? And if that means us, taking a bit more time or whatever it is, or another thing we ended up doing with it is, earlier we had been recording actually 2 episodes at a time in the larger sessions. And now we had to record basically like half of each episode, because we figured it already takes a little while for me to get approvals from first the producers and Davi, the showrunner, and also after that we then have to get a second level of approvals from FX. And usually they wanted to wait to get the entire episode done first before they gave those approvals so they could watch through the whole thing. And so I appreciated that with this, they were a bit more flexible, and they actually made it so that we could give them half of the episode for them to approve as soon as possible. And then we would send all of that material to my copyist to send to all the musicians. And that way I can be focusing on the second part of the episode while we're already recording the first part of the episode.
Incredibly work intensive. Yeah. Can you just, for my own curiosity, and I'm sure a lot of listeners will also wonder, what is the process? Are you working individually, player by player by player on their part, and then you get 8 tracks or 12 tracks or whatever each band's size is, and you assemble it? Or do you have a whole screen full of players and you go 3, 2, 1, go, and everybody plays at once? What is the process for getting a cue done?
So the way that we approached it was first trying to figure out who needed to record first, because sometimes it would be better to have maybe the basses record first so that the other musicians are playing on top of that, or maybe just have all the strings record first and then record woodwinds on top of that so that they're playing to the live strings instead of the MIDI. Same with the percussionist, having the percussionist record after all of the other musicians are recording, so that the string players and the woodwind players are playing on top of MIDI percussion, which is, much more locked in. And yeah, exactly. And then the percussionist can play around that. And then the other thing we did was have, for the string player specifically, had them layer themselves, but we had them layer 3 times, but once in mutes and once a little bit further away, so that there was just a little bit of a different kind of sound, when they're layering themselves over and over again. So we could try to get a little bit closer to that full sound. And then most of the time I would just give them a couple of days to turn it around, because we also wanted this to be as flexible for the musicians as possible to record, whenever they needed to. So, it wouldn't be as convenient to be able to set specific times, especially with so many people recording. And there were a lot of times where they would do a take and then send it to me immediately so I could listen to it and give them feedback in real time that way. But other than that, for the most part, we just trusted the musicians to do as great of a job as they can. And I think what I really appreciated from them is just that they really came through.
Do you think this is possible 10 years ago? I mean, the timing of when this pandemic happened, I hate to, if there's any positive to it, is that it happened in a time when we have all of this technology. I mean, is it the new normal? I hate to say that, but is it the new normal for a professional musician to have the ability to do this, have a remote setup like this?
I mean, I think so, to be honest. I mean, it's one other thing for us as a team. It didn't feel that new or unusual, primarily because we already have some cues and some scores that we've worked on where we just needed to send something to a guitar player or to a drummer or to a bass player to record by themselves. And that's already a practice that feels incredibly helpful sometimes because, there's so many times where I'm working on something and I think like, oh, it would be great if I had this on top of this, but I don't have time to, without a pandemic, to call a musician to come in and record it and all that kind of stuff. And so it's easy just to send it to somebody and know that we're going to get back a high quality recording. And, again, having a list of 70 something musicians that all already do this on a regular basis and are used to it, is incredibly helpful in a time like this. And so I think that the more musicians can try to work on those skills, because, it demanded a lot of these musicians. Like, they have to be their own engineer. They have to be their own, editor when they're making comps of their takes or they're exporting their stems. And you have to know how to do all that stuff to make sure that it's going to be at the level that we need it to be. And, the fact that these musicians were able to do that, I think was so helpful, and it will only be more helpful moving forward.
Are you getting hit up by other composers? Has anyone called to ask for advice on your setup?
Yeah. A couple of composers have called just asking like, what, do we use Source Connect, or do we use, FaceTime, or do we use, there's another plugin, I forget what it's called, but there's a plugin that we use on this project I did. I did the next Madden game, and we had to record all the brass separately. And there was a Pro Tools plugin that engineer recommended that we use. So different things like that, little tools and tricks we got from that. And same for me. Like, when I called Phil Eisler, he's the one that told me you should record, or he said that he was recording section leaders first. And that was helping. If you recorded the first violin first, the whole violin section was able to play to that person. And so little things like that, I think it was really cool to see how we as a community came together to figure out how we're going to get this done, asking each other for advice. I was, again, really inspired by Phil when he posted this long thing on Instagram about how he was going to make sure he took care of any musicians that needed to figure out their recording setup and all that kind of stuff. So I think that seeing things like that made me feel like, I'm in a very fortunate position right now to have a lot of work, and let me try to figure out how I can not only get it done, but get it done with the people that I care about.
So awesome.
It is really awesome. And I think the question going forward will be, do you think when this is in our rearview mirror, God willing, or not too far away from that, will you continue to record this way? Is it a thing where, you hear people are now going to do a lot more Zoom and working from home? Do you think musicians and film scores will be done remotely more, or will there be a great stampede to get back into the room together?
I think that there's still going to be, a push to get in the spaces together. I do think that it is helpful on some level. Like with Mrs. America, we found it interesting because already before the pandemic, I was experimenting with adding delays to each section and adding different delays to, the high strings than I would the low strings, and adding a different delay to the woodwinds than the strings. And so, when you're recording all in one space, you try to get as much isolation as possible to be able to add those delays and not have it affect everybody. But in this instance, I think my engineer was probably annoyed with me with how much I was taking advantage of having this much separation from people and being able to add a bunch of weird stuff to the bass but not do anything to the rest of the strings or whatever else. And so I think that on some level it could be fun to continue to record things in this way, because it'll just push us to be even more creative about how to make the sound work as best as possible, because it's not going to be the same as recording in one room all together. But I think the thing is that at the same time, nothing replaces being not only in front of that many musicians making music and playing something and what you feel from that, or even being able to hear something as a section and tell them, actually basses changed this note and cello changed this note, and in this instance you can't hear everything together until it comes together in the end, and so I think that at the end of the day, nothing can replace being able to record with a lot of people in one space. But there are some pros.
I was thinking, how do you give notes? You get a whole section playing, a whole cue, and then the writer, the showrunner, the director says, I wish, is there any way you can just measure wherever that is, 31? Can you just tacit that and have it be a rest, and you've just recorded and tripled a string section?
Yeah.
And what I love about what you said is that you're still being completely creative, and that it's leading to other creative solutions, and that's what artists do. Is you're presented with this, okay, here's the reality. I guess you have an opportunity to say, no, I won't do it unless we're in the same room, I quit. But that would be an unorthodox approach instead of, you know what, not only am I going to get it done, but let me play with this.
And as we know with all filmmaking, it's all teamwork.
Yeah.
This isn't a solo artist thing. So it doesn't work without everyone playing ball, which you're clearly proving.
Oh,
it
was so nice when you said you didn't want to be the
approach
weakest link. I thought that's so.
But just to touch on that real quick, it's so interesting. I had to cancel my wedding in the middle of all this, and what was interesting is that talking to people, and one of the post supervisor on Mrs. America, her father passed away in the middle of this, and you have these people that are dealing with things, and at the end of the day, we're all dealing with things all of the time. But I think what's interesting about being in the middle of this pandemic is we're very aware that everybody is moving through something, and so there's just this different level of empathy, and also at the same time, I just kept thinking, well, this post supervisor is dealing with her father having just passed away, and she's still trying to figure out how we can get the show done. I want to make sure that I'm just trying to pull my weight, because everybody else is probably dealing with something with this pandemic, and they're still getting it done.
Man, that is a perfect way to wrap, which is my number one lesson about being part of any filmmaking or any team is attitude is key. And listen to Kris Bowers, Maestro Bowers, telling us he wants to pull his weight.
And thanks for joining us on short notice, Kris. We talked about it last night.
And listen, I just want to extend an invitation to all our listeners. Kris is going to invite all of you to his wedding. He told us before when he reschedules the wedding, he just wants
save the date.
250,000 listeners will be attending. Save the date. Well, you'll just watch your inbox, and I think that's so thoughtful of you, Kris, to our listeners. But in addition to that, I want to say personally, thank you for blazing a trail, man. You're blazing a trail for composers to get this done, keep the work going. And to all of you, watch Mrs. America. It is really interesting, super interesting. I can't wait to get to
on FX and Hulu right now.
These episodes, because I'm not there yet, to see, is there a little more delay on the strings in episode 8? I'm going to suss it out, because
it's going to be interesting to see the difference.
I'll check it out. Hey, Kris, a million thanks, man, on short notice for showing up and teaching us a little about remote recording.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.